I grew up in a small, unremarkable town called Medicine Bow, Wyoming. If you've heard of it at all, it's probably because of Dippy the dinosaur. Dippy's skeleton, once unearthed near our town, now resides far away in the Natural History Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Aside from that quirky claim to fame, Medicine Bow is a modest place. There are some hot springs just outside of town, and it's near where Butch Cassidy once robbed a train on the nation's first transcontinental railroad. But other than those tidbits of history, there's not much to speak of, just dusty roads, patches of gravel, a scattering of trees and trailers dotting the landscape. I was raised by my mom, a single parent. She wasn't the type to enforce a list of rigid rules or rely on the word strict, but she did have one unbreakable command: never go near the house of Bob Barnes. Now, Bob wasn't your average neighbor. He lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town and made his living scavenging through other people's trash for things he could sell or repurpose. He always operated under cover of night. On the rare occasion someone caught him in the act, most were too afraid to confront him. Stories swirled that Bob had killed someone once and somehow escaped justice. My mom swore up and down that he was dangerous. A monster, she called him, and when I asked why, she would only say that the person Bob allegedly killed was a close friend of hers from high school. That's all she would ever tell me. I sometimes wondered if it was just too painful for her to share more. As I got older, pieces of Bob's life trickled my way through hushed conversations around town. People said he had fought in Vietnam, even volunteered for duty, but that something seemed broken in him when he came back. He never managed to integrate into normal life again. He parked his trailer near East Allen Lake and mostly kept to himself. Everyone warned against wandering near the lake's north side after dark. Old Bob had a habit of prowling those parts with his rifle, hunting squirrels for dinner. "Don't let him mistake you for a squirrel," people would joke, though the seriousness in their eyes undercut any humor. Despite his ominous reputation as someone to avoid, not everyone treated Bob like an outright villain. Some spoke about him as if they felt sorry for him. I remember one day when I was around 14 riding somewhere with a buddy and his mom. My friend started talking about Bob as if he were some kind of real-life boogeyman. His mom cut in, softly saying, "That poor man, all he wants is to be left alone." My friend immediately shot back, "But Mom, he killed someone." At this, her demeanor shifted unnervingly. With a stiffened face and a colder tone, she replied, "Yes, he did. And you better stay far away from his trailer." It was like we'd caught her in the middle of two truths she didn't quite know how to reconcile, a shift I wouldn't fully understand until years later. By the time I reached 17, my perception of Bob had hardened completely. He was nothing less than evil incarnate to me. My mom added fuel to that fire when one night, after having too much to drink, which wasn't common for her, she just enjoyed the occasional wine cooler while watching Dallas or Falcon Crest, she decided to open up about what had happened all those years ago. I came home late from hanging out with friends and found her sitting at the kitchen table. Old photos were spread out before her, tear stains on her cheeks. She pointed out one smiling face in particular, that of her high school friend whom Bob had allegedly murdered. It was clear how deeply this still weighed on her. She told me about their days in high school, how they used to hang out with mutual friends, sometimes at parties where they drank more than they should have. Despite his flaws, she said her friend was a good person who didn't deserve the end he met. That night by East Allen Lake had started off like so many others, teenage friends partying together under the stars. But then her friend wandered off after drinking too much, just to relieve himself in the bushes, and never came back. That was where her story paused, leaving me with an unsettling knot in my stomach but none of the answers I was looking for. At that moment, he saw someone trudging through the shrubs with what appeared to be a young child slung over their shoulder. Without hesitation, my mom's friend yelled at the figure, who immediately bolted, still carrying the child. Fueled by adrenaline and concern, he and his buddies took off in pursuit. When they finally caught up to the man, my mom's friend led the charge. But just as they closed in, the guy abruptly dropped the child, spun around and fired several shots. My mom's friend collapsed to the ground, lifeless before he even touched the dirt. Though they rescued the girl, she was rushed to a hospital, only to tragically die later from an overdose of tranquilizers that had severely damaged her organs. Everyone at the lake that night identified the attacker as Old Bob. Yet despite this, nothing ever came of it, no arrest, no trial, no justice. It baffled and outraged me that he seemed untouchable. Over time, people's bitter whispers and fearful avoidance of him started making more sense to me. While my buddy's mom might not have known the full story when she commented about that poor man, I did. I knew what he had done, or at least what I believed he had done. As the months passed, my hatred for Old Bob festered like an open wound. It gnawed at me day and night, a constant reminder of what my mom had been through. The weight of it became unbearable until I decided that I needed to act. By that point, all my friends already knew how deeply I resented him for scarring my mother with trauma she'd carry forever. But it wasn't until one night around our usual campfire that I floated the idea of doing something about it. One of my friends had asked his dad about the little girl who died all those years ago, and his dad confirmed the story was true. He said most people avoided mentioning it because you never knew when the girl's mother might overhear. It seemed she had a habit of confronting anyone who brought up her daughter's death. There was just one discrepancy in the story. According to his dad, the girl hadn't been found near the lake but had turned up somewhere in town. To me, though, this detail was irrelevant. The core truth remained intact. There had been a little girl, she had died an awful death, and old Bob had been accused of killing her and gotten away with it. That was enough for me to feel justified in seeking vengeance. That night by the campfire, I hashed out my plan with my buddies. It was simple but reckless. I'd head to old Bob's rundown trailer in the dead of night, scout it out to make sure he was asleep, and then set it on fire. At the time, it didn't even cross my mind that I could actually kill him, or anyone else who might have been inside. In my naive teenage brain, the idea seemed almost like poetic justice. I would burn his trailer to force him out into the open, leaving him with nothing but seething anger and no choice but to leave town for good. It was a childish fantasy born of rage and immaturity, a plan so flawed it could only have been conceived by a reckless kid trying to make sense of an unjust world. It took me several weeks to muster up the courage to follow through. Collecting supplies was tricky. I didn't have any money to buy gasoline or accelerants. Desperate, I ended up swiping a can of paint thinner from my school's art supply closet. A risky move itself, but one I figured was worth it. Finally, one Friday night after our group had spent hours hanging out by the campfire as usual, I told my friends I was heading home like always. Instead, with the paint thinner hidden in my backpack, I set out on foot for old Bob's trailer. The path around the lake was long and dark, taking me about an hour to reach the far side where his trailer sat in isolation. As I got closer, maybe within half a mile, I killed my flashlight and let moonlight guide me along the water's edge. In the distance, I could make out a faint glow coming from his trailer window. I hunkered down in some bushes and waited, watched every flicker of light and listened to every sound until my nerves were numb from anticipation. After about 40 or 45 minutes, I heard the low hum of a television stop abruptly, and moments later the dim light inside went out completely. The silence felt suffocating. I stayed crouched there for another minute or two just to be certain everything was still. Then, clutching the stolen can of paint thinner in one hand and my resolve in the other, I began creeping toward old Bob's trailer. My heart was racing as I crept closer, every step bringing me nearer to the old trailer. The stillness inside gave me a misplaced confidence, making me think my approach had gone unnoticed. Just as I reached to pop the lid off my can of paint thinner, ready to carry out a decision I might not fully understand even now, a sharp click cut through the silence like a thunderclap. I recognized the sound instantly, a gun being cocked. Moments later, a gravelly voice growled, "What you got there, boy?" I froze in place. It was old Bob. Somehow, he had caught me red-handed, crouched outside his trailer, preparing to set it aflame. My mind raced frantically, but all I could think was, if he realized what I'd been planning, he wouldn't hesitate to blow my head clean off. So I clamped my mouth shut, stood still, and prayed for a lifeline. "Drop it," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. My hands trembling, I released the can. It hit the ground with a dull thud, and a narrow beam of light from a small flashlight swept down to inspect it. As the truth dawned on him, his voice hardened, "Turn around." He wanted to see who had dared to sneak up on him. My feet refused to cooperate. My limbs felt weighed down by the sharp edge of terror coursing through me. Old Bob grew impatient. Before I could process what was happening, he rushed forward and spun me around himself. At first, his face was a mask of rage. But then he seemed to recognize something in mine. He shoved me backward harshly and I stumbled to the ground. Lowering his weapon slightly, he stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to say something, wanted to beg for my life, but fear had gripped my throat so tightly that no words would come. Then, breaking the silence, he said my name like a question, as if confirming my identity. In that instant, terror mingled with confusion. How did he know my name? And then, as if that wasn't unsettling enough, he mentioned my mother by name too. Heart still hammering against my ribs, I nodded meekly when he asked if I really was who he thought I was. That's when he spoke unexpected words. "I wondered how long it'd be before you'd show up." For the first time since this nightmare began, I managed to croak out something. "How do you know me?" The words fell from my lips with all the force of broken whispers. Old Bob didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward his rickety old trailer and invited me inside, saying he'd tell me everything once we were seated. Against every survival instinct screaming at me to run, I numbly followed him in. Once inside, Bob sat down heavily in a sunken armchair while I perched on the edge of a sagging couch. He looked at me for a long time before speaking again. "What did your mom tell you about me?" His question hung in the air. Fueled by adrenaline and fury that began to bubble up despite my fear, I found my voice again. I told him everything, how much I hated him for taking my mom's friend away from her and ruining her life in the process. As I recounted her story of betrayal and murder in vivid detail, old Bob sat silently, watching me with an unreadable expression. He didn't interrupt once but only smiled faintly when I came to the end of what I'd been told. Finally, in a low voice, he said, "All right, kid. Now let me tell you what really happened." The calm resolve in his tone unnerved me even more than his gun had earlier. He leaned forward slightly and began to speak. According to Bob, my mom's friend, the one she painted as an innocent victim, had been anything but that. From a young age, this guy had been troubled. And not just in some mild way. Bob said people had repeatedly tried to help him see the right path, but he'd resisted every time. Over the years, his behavior grew darker. First, his school expelled him for stealing clothes out of the girls' locker room. Later, cops picked him up for exposing himself near a group of middle schoolers, though he managed to get off lightly by claiming it had been nothing more than public urination. It got worse from there. In the months leading up to his death, rumors began circulating about him hanging around kids in town, a grown man trying to blend in with children until angry parents confronted him about it. According to Bob, this was the man who had been so dear to my mother, the one she mourned and vilified others for even questioning. Then Bob recounted the night it all went down. Bob shared that he couldn't get a good look at the kid who ran off, but he was certain that at least one of them was a girl. Afterward, he picked up the unconscious child and carried her into town. He left her at the old gas station where a night shift clerk was working. The clerk called 911, but Bob didn't wait around. Before leaving, he told the clerk there was a body near the lake, and the police should check out old Robert Barnes' place because he was responsible. The police showed up the next morning and took Bob into custody, but his story checked out. The missing girl's parents were overwhelmingly relieved to have their daughter back and could only thank him profusely. In their eyes, Bob was a hero. But Bob didn't feel like one. Ever since returning from Vietnam, he had vowed to never harm another person again, which was partly why he lived deep in the woods, away from other people. He explained that saving that girl might have made his decision to intervene feel worthwhile. But in truth, he believed she was probably already dying from some concoction of tranquilizers before he even found her. Killing the man responsible, her abductor, had done nothing in his mind, but let him escape accountability for his crimes. What made Bob feel even worse was knowing that the others involved had managed to get away with it. That same bitterness toward those who escaped punishment was what kept him from returning to town. He couldn't bear to be around adults who reminded him of the kids responsible for ending that girl's life all those years ago. He didn't know for sure who they were, but he couldn't shake the feeling my mother might have been one of them. Before we parted ways, Bob told me it didn't matter if I believed him or not. He had one request: go home, tell my mom what he told me, then look her in the eye and ask if it was true. I did just that. I wish I could skip over the details of how that confrontation unfolded because it didn't go well, to put it lightly. Suffice to say, my relationship with my mother never fully recovered after that day. In fact, she's the reason I haven't gone back to Wyoming in nearly 2 decades. Fast forward to 2002. My boyfriend and I were driving from Chicago to Vermilion, a small town in South Dakota where his parents lived. It was around noon, and we'd been driving through miles of Iowa cornfields when something odd caught my attention. The endless green suddenly disappeared, replaced by a vast expanse of ash and charred earth. My boyfriend mentioned that sometimes farmers burn their fields to prepare for the next planting season, but it still gave me an eerie feeling. The stark change in scenery meant we could now see for miles across the flat landscape, which is how I noticed them: a man and a little boy walking hand in hand through the burned fields. At first glance, it seemed sweet, like an older man taking his grandson on a walk to look at the blackened soil. But as I watched them from afar, I saw they were moving toward something, what appeared to be an old well. I didn't say anything to my boyfriend at first. We'd fallen into a lull in conversation, listening to music while enjoying the quiet of the drive. So I kept watching as we got closer, the pair becoming clearer with every passing second until I could make out almost every detail as they approached the well. The older man wore dungarees and had sparse dark hair on his head. The boy had white blonde curls, a bright blue shirt and little white sneakers. And then it happened. Just as we passed them, I saw it. The old man picked up the boy effortlessly and threw him down the well. I couldn't stop myself from yelling, "Oh my God," as loudly as I could. My boyfriend immediately snapped out of his daze and demanded to know what was happening while I frantically rummaged through my bag looking for my cell phone. I thought for a split second about asking him to stop the car so we could help, but then this horrible image filled my mind of us being shot dead by some deranged farmer in that desolate field. So instead, I told him to keep driving and tried explaining what I'd just seen, a child being thrown down a well. My boyfriend blinked in disbelief, his focus shifting nervously between me and the road ahead as I breathlessly recounted every detail. He asked if I was absolutely certain about what I saw and quickly realized how panicked and serious I was. I finally managed to locate my cell phone, but when I pulled it out and unlocked it, the screen displayed 0 bars. Frustrated, I opted for the next best solution. I grabbed our map to pinpoint the nearest town. To my relief, there was one just a few miles down the road. I urged my boyfriend to step on it so we could get there quickly and call 911. As we rolled into town, the first thing we spotted was a small roadside diner called Albert Kitchen. Without a second thought, we pulled into the parking lot. In my rush to get inside, I nearly tripped getting out of the car. As soon as I pushed through the diner doors, every person inside turned to look at me. Ignoring their stares, I hurried to the counter and asked if I could use their phone. The woman behind the counter kindly said yes and set the phone down for me. I dialed 911 without hesitation and began explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Everyone in the diner was silent, ears keenly tuned in as I described what I had witnessed. A child being thrown down a well. Gasps rippled through the room at my words. The dispatcher instructed us to stay put so a sheriff's deputy could meet us there. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and placed the handset back on its cradle with trembling hands. When I turned around, every single diner was staring at me, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. The woman behind the counter handed me a glass of ice water, murmuring something soothing to help me calm down. As my boyfriend and I waited for law enforcement to arrive, one of the other patrons, a man seated nearby, stood up and cautiously approached us. Introducing himself, he began asking questions about the burned fields we had seen while driving. When I detailed how every field for miles around had been left blackened and charred, he turned towards another diner and asked if those fields could belong to someone named Art Landry. The name stuck in my mind. I described the man I'd seen by the well, and soon whispers spread that it had indeed been Art Landry I'd encountered. Several people chimed in, noting that his grandchildren were staying with him that week while their parents were out of town. Their faces reflected equal parts shock and confusion. It was clear they knew Art well and couldn't reconcile his reputation with this gruesome act. People kept pressing me. Was I absolutely certain? Overwhelmed but resolute, I insisted I had never been more sure of anything in my life. The room fell into murmurs of, "Oh my God," and "Dear Lord." It felt like ages before a deputy finally arrived to take my statement. He ushered us outside to our car so we could speak in private, away from prying eyes and listening ears. Once again, I recounted everything I had witnessed. The burned fields, the man by the well, the child, and once again, I saw that same incredulous expression on the deputy's face. It was as if he was on the verge of dismissing me outright. As I tried to convince him of the urgency, yet another patrol car pulled up, and this time it was the county sheriff himself. The deputy saved me from retelling my story for what felt like the 100th time by briefing the sheriff directly on what I had shared. Predictably, the sheriff's immediate response was disbelief. After a brief conversation on his radio, he returned to let us know that someone from his headquarters had contacted Mr. Landry to follow up on my claims. According to him, Art denied knowing anything about what I'd reported. He said while it was true that his grandson was staying with him that week, they hadn't been anywhere near those burned cornfields. At this point, desperation clawed at me. Practically begging, I pleaded with the sheriff to drive out there with us so I could show him exactly where the well was located before it was too late for that child. He explained they couldn't just enter someone's property without a warrant and insisted he needed to speak with Art in person first. Fighting back frustration, I did everything in my power to convey how urgent this situation was, the danger that child might still be facing, whether it was drowning in water or lying injured at the bottom of a dry well. But with every frantic word out of my mouth, both the sheriff and his deputy seemed increasingly skeptical, as though they were starting to question my sanity. Finally, after more pleading than I'd care to admit, the sheriff relented and ordered his deputy to go and investigate the old well on Landry's property. Relief overwhelmed me. I nearly broke down in tears as gratitude washed over me for this small victory. While we anxiously waited for news, my boyfriend did his best to comfort me, reassuring me that everything would work out. "It's going to be okay," he kept. Initially, the well on that farm was reported to be empty. On top of that, Mr. Landry was seen heading to the diner with his grandson, providing what seemed like reassurance that everything was fine. But I was stunned, completely taken aback because I knew, without a doubt, that what I saw out there was real. Still, the sheriff took that moment to suggest I might have been mistaken, explaining how the person I saw by the well could have been someone casually lifting their child up for a look inside. He reasoned that what I interpreted as someone falling or being dropped might have been nothing more than an optical illusion caused by the speed of our car and the smoke in the distance. Yet, the question that immediately came to my mind, and I hesitated only a moment before asking, was how the deputy could be so certain that the well was empty. Was he sure, absolutely sure, there wasn't a child trapped down there? Maybe underwater or beyond the reach of his flashlight. I couldn't shake what I had seen. A child's life might be on the line, and there was no way I was simply going to accept someone else's dismissive conclusions, especially when they kept throwing around phrases like optical illusion and trick of the light. The more they repeated those terms, the more uneasy and skeptical I became. Small towns have a tendency to close ranks, protecting their own, but the total apathy they showed concerning a possible missing child wasn't just alarming, it was deeply disturbing. I forced myself to remain calm, carefully explaining to the sheriff why I was certain of what I saw. Despite my effort to stay composed, however, things quickly took another turn. The deputy re-emerged from his trip to check the well just as an old, battered truck rumbled into the parking lot. Out stepped a large man dressed in worn dungarees, his thinning dark hair catching the faint light of the setting sun. Without missing a beat, he demanded to know who had accused him of throwing his grandson down a well, his voice heavy with anger. The sheriff immediately tried to ease tensions, addressing the man, Art, as he urged calm. Ignoring this, Art walked around to the passenger door of his truck and opened it, helping a little boy out of the seat. Leading him forward, Art brought him directly in front of us and declared, in no uncertain terms, that this was his grandson, the same one whom I had supposedly seen him harm. His tone was confrontational, almost daring me to contradict him. My boyfriend leaned in at that point and whispered something meant to reassure me that everything was fine. But things were not fine. The boy standing in front of me had short, dark hair, completely different from the blonde curly-haired child I had vividly seen at the well earlier. My heart raced as panic rose in my chest. Frantically but firmly, I insisted once more that this was not the same child. The deputy tried to pacify me with yet another weak explanation. Perhaps sunlight had hit the boy's hair just right earlier, making it look blonde. The gaslighting was infuriating. They were trying to make me second-guess my own memory, my own eyes. It took everything I had not to scream right then and there. But yelling wouldn't help my case, I knew that much. Trying a different approach, I asked if there was anyone else in town I could speak to, someone who might take me seriously, because it was becoming abundantly clear that these men were not going to help me. While I argued with the deputy, the sheriff pulled my boyfriend aside for a private word. When he returned a few minutes later, my boyfriend quietly urged me to leave. As it turned out, the sheriff had warned him that if we didn't leave town immediately, I risked being arrested for causing a public disturbance. According to him, people couldn't just waltz into town making baseless accusations about people's good names. He told my boyfriend to gather me up and head out unless we had some official business left to handle. By then, all I wanted to do was get as far away from that town as possible. There was an unsettling feeling creeping over me, a heavy sense that something very sinister lurked beneath the surface of this tight-knit community. Figuring we had no hope of uncovering anything further while standing in the parking lot of that diner, I swallowed my anger and put on a mask of contrition. Forcing out an apology to Mr. Landry and his grandson, the one now standing before me, I played along with their charade. But as soon as we hit the road and my phone regained signal, I called the Iowa State Patrol and reported everything. I told them exactly what had happened and explained that something deeply disturbing seemed to be going on in that town, more specifically on Art Landry's farm. But when they went through the entire complaints process, repeatedly stating how I felt my report wasn't being handled correctly. Each time, however, they'd come back to me saying they had done everything possible and still had no updates. But I know what I saw. I've never experienced any kind of hallucination before or since. I don't wear glasses. And no, I'm not crazy. My dad used to work for the Foreign Office, and during his time in Peru he met my mom. Her Peruvian heritage has always been deeply important to her, so things like traditional food and music were staple parts of my childhood. We only visited Peru once when I was a kid though. So, in my late 20s, I decided it was time to return and explore my mother's homeland while visiting relatives. Driving on a small, remote back road in search of the tiny town where my relatives lived, I noticed flashing lights in my rearview mirror. The Peruvian police were pulling me over. Not wanting to create any trouble, I quickly stopped and readied myself to use my embarrassingly rusty Spanish. But instead of approaching my car in the slow, composed manner seen in American movies, the officer took cover behind his open car door and began barking orders through a loudspeaker. He instructed me to put my hands out the window. Instantly, I was terrified. I've rarely seen a gun in person, let alone had one aimed directly at me. As I began shouting that I was unarmed and frightened, the officer acted as though I were some dangerous fugitive, demanding that I close my mouth while he cautiously approached my vehicle. He had his gun pointed squarely at me as he tried, clumsily, to cuff me with one hand. My heart was racing. One twitch of his finger would have left blood on the passenger seat. As if that weren't horrifying enough, more police cars arrived on the scene, and before I knew it, they were dragging me out of the car and hauling me to jail. Sitting in that detainment cell was, without a doubt, the lowest point of my life. I heard officers toss around words like murderer, violator, and child abuser. To make it worse, one cop audibly gasped and said, "That's him," as I was led into the station. My mind spiraled with panic-ridden thoughts of being wrongly imprisoned in a foreign country for crimes I hadn't committed. Occasionally, officers would stop by my cell to jeer or taunt me through the bars. Each time I insisted that I was British and merely visiting for a holiday, they scoffed and told me to shut up unless I wanted them to do it for me. This nightmare dragged on for hours as I sat there convinced my life as I knew it was over. And then, without warning, someone unlocked my cell door and told me there'd been a mistake. I was free to go. Walking out of that station was utterly surreal. My hands were trembling uncontrollably, my legs barely held steady beneath me. Some officers were laughing at the colossal error they'd made, while others mumbled half-hearted apologies far too weak to match what I'd endured. They acted as if they'd mixed up a parking ticket rather than pulling me over at gunpoint and throwing me into a jail cell. I was relieved to be free, but fury boiled inside me. Still, I dared not express it for fear of giving them an excuse to detain me again. Before leaving, they showed me a picture of the man they had mistaken me for, a violent criminal on the run and truly dangerous. When I looked at his face, it was unnerving. His resemblance to me was uncanny. It was like staring into a mirror. This incident remains the most terrifying experience of my entire life. When I asked my relatives later if there was any chance I might receive compensation for what happened, they just laughed and told me there was no way. While the rest of my trip ended up being amazing, and no, I don't regret going, I've not set foot back in Peru since then. Trust me, next time, if there ever is a next time, I'm making damn sure someone picks me up directly from the airport. The worst day of my life didn't stop there. It replayed in my mind again one Sunday in a tiny town called Windsor on the Carolina coast. Back then, Windsor was a sleepy little place with fewer than 2,000 residents. It was your typical rural North Carolina town. A grocery store, a gas station, a Bojangles for fried chicken, and the peanut factory, that was about it. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Murder wasn't a common word in Windsor. It was something you only heard on the radio or saw on TV, far removed from our small town. But on the night of June 6, 1993, that all changed. That evening, as evil stepped off the screen and into our quiet streets, everything shifted. At the time, I was at the Bertie County Sheriff's Office about a mile south of town. The county jail is there too, so it wasn't unusual for me to be picking up paperwork from the deputy's station nearby. After grabbing a few forms, I settled at my desk to fill them out. The station was quiet. It was the calmest day of the week. None of us expected more than a routine call about a neighborly dispute or maybe a fender bender. But then dispatch crackled over the radio with something chilling. A call involving a man with a gun and multiple deaths. For just a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. Calls like that didn't happen in Windsor. But when I saw my fellow deputies sprinting for their cars, I knew it was real. I joined the hasty exodus, threw myself into my cruiser, and we formed a loose convoy speeding toward the north side of town. Our destination? Below, the local grocery store, its name a cheeky nod to its promise of low prices. Below wasn't just a grocery store, it was one of those places where townsfolk gathered to chat after church or catch up during late-night shopping runs. As we raced down the road, grim thoughts weighed heavily on me. If 3 people had died there, chances were good they were people I knew, perhaps even friends. When we arrived, the store was locked up for the evening since it closed early on Sundays. The details were still sketchy at best. The emergency call had come from a survivor who was barely able to speak due to severe injuries. All we really knew was that there had been a shooting, there were bodies, and there were survivors in desperate need of help. The storefront's long row of glass windows gave us an immediate glimpse inside, a trail of blood leading from the front door to the back of the store. My colleagues and I wasted no time breaking in. The source of the blood wasn't immediately obvious, until we found one of Below's cleaning crew members collapsed near the back office. Clinging to life despite gunshot wounds, this person had managed to drag themselves across the floor to use the store phone and call for help. After ensuring they got immediate medical attention, we fanned out through the aisles, clearing each one with weapons drawn. The place was eerily silent save for our cautious footsteps and breathing. We didn't know if someone might still be lying in wait. Toward the back of the store we made another gruesome discovery: 5 people. 3 were dead, each lost to gunfire, while another clung to life with multiple stab wounds. The 5th person, miraculously, was unharmed but drenched in blood and visibly traumatized. As paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize the survivors for an airlift to the hospital, we began piecing together what had happened from that lone uninjured witness. Their account confirmed what we had feared. This was even worse than anything we'd imagined. Every week on Sunday evenings after closing time at 6 p.m., a cleaning crew would arrive at Below to prepare the store for a fresh start on Monday morning. As usual, after ushering out the last customers for the day, the store manager locked up and let the crew inside to start their work. They moved mats and readied their machines for floor buffing, unaware of the horror about to unfold. Meanwhile, as one of the clerks finished her shift near the front counter, she noticed someone stepping quietly out from one of the aisles, a face she didn't recognize. Assuming it was just a customer who hadn't realized the store had closed, she approached him to let him know they were no longer open. When she did, he pulled a gun and pointed it straight at her. The cleaning crew, preoccupied with their tasks at the front of the store, didn't hear or see what was happening. The armed man moved silently as he forced the clerk toward the back office where the manager was tallying cash for deposit. The timing couldn't have been worse, or better for him. It was the end of the week, when business had been brisk and cash reserves were high. He threatened the manager into surrendering not just all of that night's cash but also several money orders totaling around $3,000. At this point he could have fled with his loot, his objective had been achieved. But instead of leaving he chose to escalate things even further. With his firearm still drawn, he marched the manager and clerk back onto the shop floor and rounded up the I didn't see exactly how the victims were restrained, but later I heard it was with dog leashes the gunman had grabbed from one of the store aisles. After rounding up all 6 people and forcing them to the back of the store, he made them tie each other up at gunpoint. For the last person he did it himself. According to the survivor, they thought the worst was over at that point. The robber had the money, everyone was tied up, and it seemed like he had no reason to escalate further. But what happened next was beyond comprehension. The gunman started stacking people in pairs, forcing them to lie on top of each other. Before anyone could grasp his intentions, he uttered, "God forgive me for what I'm about to do," and began shooting into the stacks of people. He only managed a couple of shots before his gun either jammed or ran out of ammunition. When he fled at that moment, the survivor thought the nightmare was over again. But shortly after, the gunman returned. This time he had grabbed a knife from somewhere in the store. What followed was even more horrific. The gunman confronted the survivor, asking if they would inform the police about him. Terrified, the survivor denied it, as did the man lying on top of him, who, heartbreakingly, turned out to be his own brother. Despite their pleas and assurances, the gunman flew into a rage. He brutally stabbed the brother, slitting his throat from ear to ear before continuing to stab him in the back until the knife blade broke off inside his body. The gunman then asked the survivor again if he planned to betray him to the authorities, repeating his earlier question like a cruel taunt. When the survivor again insisted he wouldn't, the killer finally left with the stolen money. However, even after the gunman was gone, the survivor was paralyzed with fear, certain the man might return. Pinned beneath his brother's lifeless body, moving was impossible even if he'd had the courage to. Eventually, another member of the cleaning crew, who had also been bound but survived because the killer thought he was dead, managed to free himself from his leash. He crawled toward the front of the store with a phone in hand and was discovered there later. The investigation that followed became one of the most unsettling cases I've ever experienced. One of the victims was related to the county sheriff, who made it his mission to track down the killer no matter what. But from day one, obstacles hindered our efforts. First, none of it was caught on camera because the store's biosecurity system had been down at the time. A technician had been scheduled to repair it later that week. The timing of that failure still weighs heavily on everyone involved. We had no footage to identify or track our suspect. Second, while all three survivors gave consistent descriptions of the man, they only got us so far. He was described as having distinct features, hazel eyes and a crooked nose. Despite circulating sketches based on these accounts far and wide, they didn't result in any solid leads. The most we had initially was a report of a white sedan with Maryland plates speeding out of town on Route 17 shortly after the murders. Investigators tracked the car down, only to discover its owner had no connection to the crime. They just happened to be in the wrong place at an incredibly unfortunate time. Adding to our frustration was how fixated parts of the investigation became on one questionable detail from that night. At some point during the ordeal, one victim asked the killer why he was doing this, not why they were being stacked together but in a broader, more desperate sense. "Why are you doing this?" The killer reportedly responded by claiming he was a recently fired police officer. This sparked early investigations into whether he might have been former law enforcement or ex-military. That theory gained significant traction despite evidence indicating otherwise. There were no fingerprint matches in any law enforcement databases. Some of us suspected something entirely different, that he was a fugitive trying to silence witnesses before vanishing completely. But by the time this angle began receiving serious attention from investigators, it was too late. With thousands of dollars stolen from the scene, he could have easily fled the country by then. Even now, it's hard not to dwell on all that went wrong in this case, how close we came yet didn't find him, and how devastating it was for everyone involved. The violence and senselessness of it all still weigh heavily on my mind. That's my best guess as to why he wasn't caught in the end. Afterward, law enforcement officials talked about the events like they were some kind of natural disaster, an unstoppable force, a random storm that swept through and left devastation in its wake. They made it seem like nothing and no one could have prevented it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of failure. The worst tragedy to hit Windsor in over 2 centuries, and where was I in all of it? Sitting at a desk, buried in paperwork, while someone with a sick mind was out there, taking lives 2 at a time. What haunts me most is trying to understand why he let the last victim live. According to the survivor, the killer explicitly said, "I'm going to let you live." That single line complicates my theory about him being on the run. A part of me believes he had simply exhausted himself, too drained to keep killing. Maybe the thought of stabbing another person after taking 4 lives was too much, even for someone like him. But then again, there's another possibility that creeps into my mind. Maybe he wanted someone alive to recount it all. Perhaps he wanted his work to be known, and wanted the world to read about his crimes in the papers. I resist dwelling on that thought because when I do, it cuts even deeper, amplifying the ache of knowing we couldn't stop him. Music fades in. I grew up in Bart Township, a rural town nestled in Pennsylvania. If there's a contest for how rural a place can get, Bart would win hands down. Especially out near Nickel Mines where I lived, a community largely of old order Amish folk. Now, if you're picturing teenagers on Rumspringa or Amish families with modern essentials like flip phones, that's not the kind of Amish I'm talking about. The old order are something else entirely. They stick to traditions so strictly that they still use English as a blanket term for anyone who is an Amish. That was the backdrop of my childhood, feeling like outsiders in our own country. But I didn't know any different back then. As far as I was concerned, it was home and I was content. That is, until October 2, 2006. Like most kids in our community, I left school after the 8th grade to help out on the family farm. That day began just like any other. My dad and I were working outside while my little brother was at school. It was a normal morning, the usual hum of farm life, until my dad suddenly stopped what he was doing and said, "Is that your brother?" I squinted toward the train tracks running parallel to our property and spotted a tiny figure sprinting toward us as fast as his legs could carry him. Even from a distance I could see it was my brother. My dad frowned before muttering, "What the heck is he doing out of school? It's only 11 in the morning." Without hesitation, Dad marched off toward the house while I trailed behind him, filled with a gnawing sense of unease. By the time we got to the front door, my brother was inside, sobbing hysterically into my mom's arms. Dad, still assuming my brother had simply run away from school for some childish reason, was annoyed and gearing up to scold him. But then my brother choked out the words that froze everything, "There's a man in our classroom, he has a gun." For a moment, it was as if the world had stopped spinning. As if that weren't terrifying enough, as Dad grabbed his rifle with trembling hands and prepared to storm out of the house, my brother added something else. "He has chains too. And hooks." That was it. Dad didn't say another word. His temper had boiled over into pure action. With his face set like stone and his rifle in hand, he tore out the door, heading straight for the old schoolhouse down the road. His last command before disappearing over the horizon was for me to stay put and look after Mom and my brother. We waited for hours for Dad to return. When he finally did, we gathered around him as he relayed what had happened that day, a tale we could barely process. At around 10:30 that morning, just after recess had ended, an unfamiliar pickup truck pulled up in front of the old schoolhouse. A man emerged from the truck and casually walked inside, where he interrupted class by approaching the teacher at her desk. Politely enough, and without raising suspicion, he asked her if she'd happened to find a clevis pin on the road nearby. It wasn't a strange question in and of itself. Clevis pins are common around farms, used like small bolts for fastening machinery together. But when the teacher told him she hadn't seen one and wished him good luck finding it, something shifted. The man wanted to force the children to witness what he was about to do. While he was preoccupied with supervising the unloading of his truck, one of the kids' teachers seized the opportunity to escape and managed to reach a nearby farmer, who immediately called 911. Realizing that the teacher had fled, the man ordered one of the boys to retrieve her. Meanwhile, he began barricading the doors of the schoolhouse using lumber and nails that the boys inside had carried for him. Once he was done, he allowed 3 parents, including one who was reportedly pregnant, and all the boys in the class to leave. What followed was nothing short of harrowing. He made all the girls line up against the chalkboard as if setting up for an execution. The first police car arrived swiftly, just minutes after the farmer's call to emergency services. Through a loudspeaker, officers pleaded with him to surrender his weapons and release the girls. At nearly the same time, the man called 911 himself, warning the dispatcher that if police attempted to intervene, he would kill the girls. He made this chilling declaration right in front of them, leaving the terrified children fully aware of what he planned to do. Some of the girls reportedly begged him not to harm them, while 2 even requested to be shot first, perhaps hoping their deaths would spare their classmates. Ignoring their pleas, he continued speaking calmly to law enforcement. By 11 a.m., a large crowd had gathered outside the schoolhouse alongside a line of ambulances ready to assist in case of injuries. When gunfire broke out inside, everything descended into chaos. According to eyewitness accounts, an overwhelming wail swept through the crowd, a raw, collective expression of grief. Each gunshot shattered lives and devastated countless families. As gunshots erupted, police stormed toward the schoolhouse in a desperate attempt to stop the massacre. But before they could enter, the man began firing at them through a window. Officers cautiously returned fire, targeting only the window where he was positioned. Shortly after that exchange, the gunfire ceased. Unable to hear further movement inside, officers believed he might either be wounded or pausing to reload. When they finally breached the schoolhouse doors, they found him dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. It later emerged that just before his rampage began, he had tried to phone his wife to say goodbye. She reportedly didn't answer but found a note at home detailing his gruesome plan. Horrified, she called 911 in an attempt to thwart him. Tragically, her call came too late. The nightmare was already unfolding. In total, 10 girls were shot that morning, only 4 survived. While some were declared dead at the scene, heartbreaking reports emerged of one young girl succumbing to her injuries while being cradled by a state trooper who tried to console her in her final moments. The victims ranged in age from just 6 to 13 years old. Adding another grim detail to an already horrific event, it was later discovered that midway through his attack, the gunman swapped his pistol for a shotgun. Disturbingly, even though there was still ammunition left for his pistol, he made this switch. Most believe it was an intentional choice meant to inflict greater damage and leave an even more nightmarish scene behind. In the aftermath, as details surfaced about the man responsible and his motives, a dark picture began to take shape. The identity of the shooter came as a shock because almost everyone in the nickel mines area recognized him. His name was Charlie Roberts, a Georgetown resident who worked as a milk truck driver, regularly visiting local farms and even knowing some of his victims' families. He had a wife and 3 young children of his own at the time of the massacre. Interviews with his co-workers revealed that Charlie had struggled with depression in the past. Ironically, they claimed he seemed oddly upbeat in the days leading up to his crime, a sinister calm that investigators surmised stemmed from his decision to carry out this unspeakable act. Authorities also believed that Charlie might have been influenced by another tragic hostage situation in Colorado that occurred earlier that same week. His actions left an indelible mark on a community known for its peace and simplicity. The sheer brutality of what happened, the taking of innocent lives, calculated with such malice, shattered not only those directly affected but also anyone who heard about this tragedy. It remains a stark reminder of how deeply mental anguish and unchecked inner demons can culminate in unimaginable horror. The tragedy involving Charlie Roberts remains a deeply disturbing and painful story. While no definitive answers could be gathered due to his death, the notes he left behind, along with the voicemail he recorded for his wife that morning, offered some insight into his disturbed state of mind. These revelations painted a grim picture of a man tormented by both his past and current struggles. Reports suggested that Roberts, at the age of 12, had sexually abused 2 female relatives. Decades later, he admitted to his wife that he experienced urges to harm children again, and evidence found at the crime scene, like the presence of lubricants, hinted at dark intentions. Roberts also wrote about how the death of his daughter during childbirth, nearly 10 years earlier, had filled him with hatred and resentment toward both himself and God. This loss appeared to have further fueled his unthinkable actions. However, counterclaims arose. The 2 female relatives who were allegedly abused denied that such incidents ever occurred, potentially as a means of protecting their privacy. Despite these claims, Roberts' later actions shocked everyone, as he murdered several young girls in cold blood at a schoolhouse before ending his own life. The aftermath of the tragedy saw the local Amish community respond in profound and unique ways. The schoolhouse itself was demolished within a week to ensure it didn't become a haunting reminder of what had taken place. The most striking aspect of their response, though, one that drew both admiration and debate, was their act of forgiveness. The Amish people extended their compassion not only to their own community but also to Robert's family. They visited his father, who was devastated by the horrific actions of his son, and told him they forgave Charlie. Some even attended Charlie's funeral as an expression of support for his grieving family. While this forgiveness demonstrated immense grace and empathy for some, including me, it raised unsettling questions. While I admired the willingness to absolve those not directly responsible for such evil, I couldn't bring myself to forgive Charlie. I struggled with the idea that forgiving him somehow served as a measure of faith or devotion. As discussions emerged about moving on and trusting God to safeguard the future, I found myself questioning whether this outlook dismissed the need for practical prevention measures to avoid future tragedies. The incident and its aftermath marked a turning point in my life. Though raised as part of the Old Order Amish community, I began to realize how different my beliefs were becoming. I could no longer reconcile my thoughts with some of the principles held so dearly by those around me. It has now been nearly 10 years since I left nickel mines behind, both physically and spiritually. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. If you enjoyed it or found it thought-provoking, consider hitting the notification bell so you'll be updated on future narrations. I upload new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and I also host live streams every Sunday and Wednesday evening. Have a story you'd like to share? Send it over to letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. Who knows, it might even be featured in an upcoming video. For those looking to support this channel further, consider checking out my Patreon or clicking the join button for exclusive perks. Don't forget to listen to the Let's Read podcast for longer compilations, available wherever you stream your podcasts. And for true crime enthusiasts, be sure to check out my other channel, Saturn Soul. Links are below in the description. Lastly, taking a sharp detour into an entirely different topic, Bigfoot. Yes, we've all heard stories about this elusive creature. The famous footage captured by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin in 1967 still sparks endless debates. The notion that Bigfoot could be connected to ancient interactions between humans and great apes like gorillas or orangutans is undoubtedly wild but intriguing to ponder. Whether you believe in Bigfoot or not, it's important to remember that if we want to make meaningful change in the world, whether through environmental conservation or how we deal with moral dilemmas, it ultimately falls on us as individuals. Ignoring problems or relying on myths won't solve the real challenges we face today. Let's strive for a better future by addressing issues head-on, together.